Hello, my name is Michael Nolan, and today we are going to talk about financial management. Let's look at the slide, outline what we're going to talk about. First of all, we're going to talk about ratio analysis and how to manage your business using ratio analysis. Then we're going to talk about the 3 influences on price. After that, we look at break-even analysis, because if you don't know how much you need to sell to break even, you don't know where your profits are starting to be made. So it's a good idea to have some idea of how to look at break-even analysis. Costing and pricing, different attitudes to both, and how you can maximize and adopt different practices on pricing to different situations. And then managing debtors, very important for maintaining the cash flow. So all of these are necessary in order to generate good business on the financial management. So let us start by looking at using ratios to manage. Many ratios can be used. There are literally probably hundreds you can use, but it's difficult using too many. You may get confused. Use ones that are suitable for your business, that are relevant to running your company. They will vary from industry to industry, and also tactically you may want to look at some more than others in different years. Key performance indicators, they're often called, in looking at what drives the business. Ones that manage your objectives and look at your objectives and drive those, they would be key performance indicators. What follows is 10 common ratios. They're not the only ones. They're not necessarily the most popular. I suppose like in an economist's view, it will vary from one to the other. But there are 10 fairly popular ratios that are very common. The first one is pre-tax profits to turnover. And as we can see in the white part here, pre-tax profits is divided by turnover and then multiplied by 100 in order to give you a percentage score. So it tells you that profits are 5%, 7% of the sales. The next one then, return on capital employed, also called the ROCE, as the headings on each word suggest. This again looks at pre-tax profits, except this time you divide it by a combination of shareholders' funds, long-term loans, and other long-term liabilities. So in looking at that and multiplying that figure by 100, again to get the percentage, you get the return on capital employed. This is used for looking at the effectiveness of the business and how efficient it is. If it's too low, it's seen that there might be problems with liquidity in the future, and you have to watch that. And if it's below the bank rate of borrowing, well, it suggests that maybe you should be in a different business, or you shouldn't be in this business at least, because you're not generating enough profits to reinvest in the business by borrowing. Gross gearing, it's the next one. So what does that tell you? Gross gearing looks at the amount of borrowings you have, both short-term loans and long-term loans, and then you divide that by shareholders' funds. In other words, the amount you have invested in your business plus the profits you have retained in it. And that figure is divided by 100 and gives you a percentage. The figures on this can vary a lot as to what is good and what is not so good. But in looking at banks, they would say, we would like you to have half the amount of borrowings as you have shareholdings. But realistically, probably a 1-to-1 ratio is more common. So it does vary a lot. Above that level, they start to get a little nervous. It would depend on the amount of borrowing that you have. It would depend on the amount of assets you have that's covering that borrowing, as to whether the banks would get very nervous or not. but it's something that you have to look at and see, well, how far can we go without upsetting the banks? So it's a very important ratio from that point of view. The other thing to remember in this is as debt increases, your risks increase as well. Because if things go wrong, if the market has a downturn and your profitability is hit, then your ability to repay the loans that you have is hit, and the gross gearing gets more vulnerable. So next we have current ratio. The current ratio is, as we can see here at the top of the white line, stocks plus debtors plus cash. All of these come from the current assets, and it's divided by the current liabilities, which is a combination of creditors plus short-term loans and other current liabilities. That might be tax that you owe the government or something like that. So with all of these things, it's about managing it, and this is one of the ratios you use for managing your cash. There is a more stringent one, which I haven't included here, called the asset test. It takes stocks out of the current assets, so you're just looking at debtors and cash divided by all of the others there in terms of creditors, short-term loans, and other current liabilities. And the reason for that is, if you have stocks and you're getting into trouble, it's very difficult to get the full value or anywhere near the full value of them. If you have cash, you have the full value. Debtors, probably 80%, maybe 85% you will get. But stocks, it could be as high as 50, it could be as low as 20%. So therefore, it has to be managed more. Next we have debtor payment days. That looks at, as we can see here, debtors divided by turnover multiplied by 365 in order to give you the number of days that debtors are held. The important thing to remember with debtors is, depending on your year end, they may be particularly high. For example, if your year end was December, and if Christmas was an important season for you and you had lots of sales, you might have the sales, but you might not have the debtors in. So they would be artificially high. And therefore, over time, you can measure it from one year to the next as to whether it's good. But looking at that particular year, it may appear high. So it's something to be conscious of and to look at and say, well, how can we improve this? It may require you changing from a different year end, but it's hardly worth it for that. You can get an idea looking from year to year. So it is an important ratio. Coupled with that, which I haven't put in the top 10, is creditor payment days. So there you're looking at the creditors divided by the suppliers, the cost of bought-in materials, multiplied by 365. Gives you the same thing, the number of days that you have as creditors. And looking at the creditor days and the debtor days, how do they match? Also, if you're doing benchmarking, competitiveness benchmarking, you should be able to get data on what other companies are achieving and how are you in comparison to those companies. So that's always worth looking at and seeing, how do I compare? How good am I? And therefore, what do I need to do to improve if I'm not as good as the average or the upper quartile, as they call it. So all of these things are relevant. The next one then is stock turn. Stock turnover, you look at, again, the ratio here is the sales or the turnover per year and the average stock. What they mean by average stock is you look at the opening stock plus the closing stock and divide it by 2, and that gives you an average stock. And that tells you how many stock turns there are per year. It's a very important ratio in managing stock and in trying to drive it down so that you can become more competitive. So it's important to be managing that and to see how efficient you are at your stock management. The stock itself can often be finished stock, or it can be work in progress, or it can be raw materials. and you sometimes have to manage those individually and see how they are doing. So it's a matter of looking at all of these things together and deciding how can they be managed. Some companies use stock as a marketing tool, and they will keep stock high in order to be able to deliver the stock or the component, the product, when it's asked for by the company or by the customer. To me, that is good in one sense, and I have no problem with it, provided there's profitability matching holding that stock. So if you're making above average profits and holding above average stock, that's fine. But it is inefficient, and if you're doing lean manufacturing, you're able to get your stocks down and become more efficient. And each 10% of stocks that you improve, you can put that for other parts of the cash flow, for running the business, for borrowing less money. So it's very important from that point of view. When I'm benchmarking companies, I often use graphical images, like say a lovely house, to represent the company's stocks that are above the average. And this brings it home very hard and very direct to companies. Oh, if I improve my stock, I could have that house. So it's good to have images like that as a reminder for what you're behind other companies in terms of stocks. Added value. This is a very important component of efficiency, in looking at efficiency. The ratio is made up of added value, which is your sales minus your raw material costs. That's what's called added value. And you divide that by your sales figure and multiply it then by 100, and that gives you the added value ratio. It's a good basic productivity ratio and shows that if you have been working on improvements in the raw materials area, where you're improving your supplies of raw materials, you're reducing the cost of raw materials, you'll see it impacted on that ratio. It would also improve if your prices improved. Not always easy to get improvements in prices, but it can happen. And it would show in there as well. So they're good ones for looking at in terms of looking at increasing the value that you're creating in the business. The next one then is wages. Now, wages, as we can see here, is wages divided by sales multiplied by 100. Now, in looking at wages, you include such things like pension costs, social welfare costs, other costs like that that are directly related to the wages. It again is a good productivity improvement tool in seeing if you're improving your efficiency of the business, how does that look and how efficient is it? So overall, wages is a good way of looking at productivity improvements. The second last one then is turnover per employee. This is one of the core productivity measures: turnover per employee, profit per employee, added value per employee. Looking at the combination of those three, you get an idea of how productive a company is. Turnover per employee here is turnover, as we can see there, divided by the number of employees. Very simple. And it gives you a value in dollars or whatever your currency is. And you can compare that then against other companies if you're doing benchmarking. And it's a good way of seeing good productivity scores. So it's also, if you have made investments in automation, you'll see improvements there. And that needs to be taken into account in terms of, is it genuine productivity or is it just coming from the investments that you've made? So looking at that will tell you. The final one then is growth in turnover. This basically looks at this year's turnover versus last year's turnover. And that's divided then by, or multiplied by 100 so that you get a percentage. So it tells you the growth in turnover. Your sales have grown by 10% or whatever it is. And how does that compare with inflation? Is it ahead of inflation? Is it behind inflation? So you're constantly looking at that and managing it and trying to see, at least stay ahead of inflation, but significantly ahead of it is better. But then turnover on its own is not good. Profitability has to be there as well. But it's still a good ratio in terms of looking at what is needed and managing that as best as possible. Now, we move on to costings and pricing. There are three influences on price: customers, competitors, and costs. Obviously, customers influence it because they're buying from you. Competitors, they're selling to other customers, and the costs are your internal costs associated with that. As it says here, customers usually have choices from whom they buy. Are there switching costs available? Is there substitutes? What do they do if they don't like yours? Can they go to a competitor easily? All of these has to be looked at. Is there backward integration? Could they move into your business by buying a competitor? And then they wouldn't be buying from you anymore. In addition to not buying from you, they are also in direct competition with you and will understand your customers a lot better than you do. So it's something you have to watch and be aware of in terms of the price of products. Then we have products that are usually designed to give better value. So if you can put value into a new product that you've made, extra value to the customer, you then can charge a better price for that if they have valued it. The voice of the customer, which we talk about in marketing, will tell you what they value and how they value it. And that will then help to look at pricing and to try and get a better price than what you've had before. So this is particularly an area you need to look at and say, how can we add value through innovation, through better marketing of our products to get better prices. In terms of competitors, the level of competition affects price. We've seen that earlier. So if there's intense competition on prices, it means that prices will fall and it's very hard to build it up. If there's only a few companies in the marketplace and they have high levels of capacity, that can have really intense competition. Tandem with that, you can have a situation where there are lots of equally weighted competitors. They're all roughly around the same size, same strength, and they're fighting for market share. Some of them will be increasing in size, others will be decreasing, but there's always this constant share for prices. And the prices tend to drop in those situations unless you can differentiate yourself sufficiently from the competition. So it's important to be looking at things like differentiation in those situations. If there's overcapacity, prices will fall because overcapacity leads to intense competition, and it means that the fixed costs are very high, that they have probably increased the cost of machinery and technology so that they have to recover those costs. And in doing so, it takes a long time to recover those prices. So overcapacity has an impact on prices, which needs to be looked at when you're addressing these issues. Then we have new technology, and this helps to increase prices. If you have new technology which the customer values, then your prices can increase, and it gives you an edge with the competition as well. So that gives you an advantage. But likewise, if a competitor has come up with new technology, it affects your prices, and they can charge more for their prices, and you will probably have to charge less to try and keep the business. So that creates difficulties in terms of maintaining profits and maintaining prices. Then there's costs, the final part of this triangle. Costs influence prices in a competitive environment. So if you have high costs, you have to get high prices. There's no way around that, and it means that you're looking at trying to achieve that, constantly looking for opportunities on that. If, for example, a customer introduces own labels and they can be charging cheaper prices, that will affect the costs. The costs come down, the prices come down, and it affects competition overall outside of what they're immediately selling as their own brand. So that is sort of competition does affect prices, and the costs reduced in that will affect them. Then there can be internal production or external supplier costs. So depending on what the internal company costs, or if you're buying in the product and selling it on, the costs are external to you and you have no hope of doing much with them. But if they're internal, you can work on them. You can work on your costings through lean business activities and then try and see, where do we go from here? How do we try and get those costs down? And how can we improve our position there? Then there's new process technology influencing costs and prices. So if you find another way of making your product that costs less, that will influence prices. So you need to look at what new technologies are out there. How can we avail of them? How can they impact on price and on costs, trying to reduce your costs down. I think actually there's a good example that going back about 50, 60 years, if anyone has heard of Bic Barrows, that's the basic plastic barrow that's around now. I think it was in the late 40s or early 50s they were introduced. Totally new technology. Up to then you had fountain pens, and pens were made with metal, costly. So what did they do? They introduced an automated system, and they introduced new technology, plastic. This reduced the costs per item right down and made sure that they could sell their plastic barrows at a fraction of what they were sold at before then. And because of that, it made a huge impact on how they ran their business and how they expanded their business. And in turn made a big impact on the availability of pens to people. Up to then, pencils would have been used widely and pens not so much. So that was a big impact, and it also created a new segment in the market of plastic barrows as opposed to metal pens. The break-even point is very important in running your business, to know where that is, to know when you're starting to make money. How much do you need to sell per month, per week, certainly per year? How much do you need to sell in order to start making money? And knowing that break-even point is very important, and we're going to come on to that next. But it's particularly important in competitive industries because you need to see where is that coming from, where is the break-even point, how can we lower that break-even point so that we can become more competitive than we were before. Because if you don't do that in competitive industries, it means that you start losing control of the business to other companies who are more competitive than you. So it's very important to know the break-even point and know how to achieve that and how to get it down. So let us now go on to break-even analysis and see what's involved here. If you look at the slide, the first statement says it involves a geographical representation of the relationship between sales, costs and profit. And I'll be showing you graphs which will explain that more clearly. But basically, if your sales increase, then your profits can increase. If your costs reduce, your profits increase. And then in costs, you have fixed costs and you have variable costs. So the second statement then, it says it identifies the level of sales that must be reached to recover your costs. And that's what's called the break-even point. It's only recovering the costs. But in a competitive environment, that is very important to know at what point you're recovering costs. Because in competitive environment, with some companies you're selling at a loss, with other companies you're selling at a profit, and overall you're trying to make a modest profit in how you manage this overall process. So it's difficult to achieve, but you have to keep working at it and looking at that. The third point then, break-even point is where costs are equal to the sales. So that's self-explanatory. You just have to identify that point at what number of sales you have to make in either value or in volume. Sales minus variable cost is next, and that equals contribution. So the contribution you make is a bit like the gross profit, if you've heard that term before. It may be exactly the same, it may be similar to it depending on the way you do things. But sales minus the variable cost. Variable cost would usually be the raw material cost, may be considered labour costs as well, depending on whether you take them as a fixed amount or they vary a lot. So looking at those, you get a contribution per item. So the formulas we're going to look at below this are contribution margin percentage, and that is the contribution per unit divided by sales per unit. So in looking at that, you're getting a contribution margin. The break-even point in units, so you're looking at what are your fixed expenses, not the variable expenses, but the fixed expenses. And then the contribution per unit, how much is that and how are we doing there? So looking at that, you come up with the break-even point in units. And then finally, the break-even point in value. Equally important. Not more, not less, but equal. So this looks at the fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin percent. And get that figure and you have the break-even point in value. So it tells you how much sales you need to make in order to achieve the break-even point. Obviously, you need to go beyond the break-even point because in order to do that, you have to start making money. Now, let's go on to the next one and give you an example. So, break-even point. We see here the break-even point is where the yellow and the orange lines intersect. And you're looking at how we can achieve this. You have value here going up, and you have volume here. Your fixed costs are the amount of overheads you have in place, and whether they are high or low will depend on how far up this graph it goes. Then you have the variable costs, the yellow line, and in seeing the yellow line here, the variable costs, you can see they're going up at a straight line in so much per volume. And then the sales, they're increasing from 0 here right up, and they're increasing all the time. And the break-even point, as I said, is where the sales and the variable costs intersect, having built the fixed costs first, then the variable costs, and then the sales. So, the break-even point example. In this example, we have the unit costs of units of 15,000, fixed costs of $50,000. The value per unit, the sales price is $15. The variable contribution is $10, and then the contribution is $5, or 33%. So, let's look at question 1. What is the break-even point in units? Well, the break-even point is the fixed costs, $50,000, divided by the sales per unit, which is $5, so that we see there are $10,000 needed to break even. If you have 10,001 units sold, you're making money, you're making profits. Up to that point, you're making losses. So, for example, you might divide that by 12 and figure so many per month. Or it might be per week you look at it. But you use that information, that's how many units you need to sell each year and to make money beyond that point. But it tells you what's the break-even point in units. The second question then is, what is the break-even point in value? And we have, again, fixed cost $50,000. The contribution percent is 33.33%. And that gives you sales of $150,000. So if you're selling above $150,000, you're making money. Below that, oh, you're losing money, I'm afraid. So it gives you a good idea as to what you need to be selling per month to make money. The next one then is maximize profitability, and this can be done in 3 ways: by increasing your sales, by increasing your prices, or by lowering your costs. Let's look at examples of these. The first one here is increase sales. In this, you have the orange line going up and then the increase in sales, and you can see that the gap, say at this point between profit and sales, is so wide, and then up at this point it's so much wider. So therefore, as you're increasing your sales, the value of profit is increasing. The percentage remains the same, but the profit in the bank increases all the time. In the second one, over here on the right hand side at the top, reduce costs. In this, we see the blue line, the cost line, is lower down from the profit line, and therefore the margin has increased of profitability by reducing the costs. This is a very important thing and something that you can do without the customer knowing necessarily that you have done this. So therefore your prices can improve, your margins can improve without the customer knowing. And where you have powerful customers, this is very important. So it's worth looking at in terms of how can we reduce our costs of our business and improve the profitability. It's a bit like in innovation, they talk about process innovation as being invisible. It's the exact same here. Any improvements you make on the costs are invisible to the customer. So therefore, the margin you're getting is improving without him knowing. If your customer knows this, he may try and take some of that margin by saying, you reduced your costs, so you reduce your price. So let's go to the third one then, the bottom right, left-hand side, increase prices. So in this one, we can see the sales line has moved up and the price increase has taken place, and the impact on that is gradual and consistent with creating a bigger gap. And this is difficult sometimes to do, particularly in competitive environment where there's a lot of competition. It's not easy to increase prices. But where you can, it's very often better to increase prices gradually and maybe 2 or 3 times a year with smaller price increases rather than one big increase which makes a bigger impact. But if you can achieve price increases, it does improve the contribution and the profitability of the business. So, if we looked at this fourth chart here, the bottom right hand side, total profit impact. So by that we mean the impact of number 1, sales increase, number 2, reduce costs, number 3, increase prices. If you have all of those, you have a much bigger profit if you can impact all 3. Obviously difficult to do, but something to aim at. On the next one, we're looking at pricing when it's market-based. So in other words, you're looking at customers and what influences them. Moral pricing is the first one here. That's where you have a situation where the company feels an obligation not to charge too much, that they have only a certain price that they were willing to charge the customer, what's right and fair. Sometimes monopolies use this as a way of keeping competition out and keeping the monopoly situation, that they will keep prices low so to discourage competition from coming in and competing with them directly. The second one then is pricing points. This is where if you go into, say, a store and they're selling something for $9.99 as opposed to $10. The reason for that is because psychologically, oh, it's not even $10, it's great. I know I find I sometimes look at products and say, oh, it's only because of the psychological pricing. So they know that there's psychological barriers there in different types of stores, different points of pricing. They will say, if you keep below that, you'll get more business. And therefore, have this psychological pricing and have price points. Promotional pricing. That's when you're maybe coming into a new market and you're trying to build up market share. So you put it at a lower price. The important thing to remember with promotional pricing is you can't keep doing it. If you continue on with promotional pricing, it becomes the norm, the standard. And therefore, you're selling at small margins and trying to make money, very difficult to do. So promotional pricing you use occasionally to build up business at times where you're not so busy, low season. You use promotional pricing. Very often you see in supermarkets, for example, products being sold 2 for the price of 1. That's promotional pricing. Penetration pricing. That's when you're charging a really low price in order to get as much market share as you can. Japanese would generally be fairly good at penetration prices at the early stages of products in order to try and maximize what they're doing there. Prestige pricing and skimming. That's where you charge a large amount of money, an obscene amount of money for a product. For example, perfume or a Ferrari car. It's based on prestige pricing. You certainly won't sell it cheap. And if it's cheap, people will ask, oh, is it any good? So you're building up a lot of marketing around this, which is costing more anyway. But you're also building up the image of the product as being really powerful. Cost-based pricing. So standard costing is the first one there. And with standard costing, you're looking at what are the fixed costs, what are the variable costs, and therefore what's the price that we can get for this. It's not based on customer demands and what you perceive the customer will pay. It's based on what you perceive as being a way to make money if you can get that price. The second one then is cost and plus profit. So you work out your costs and you say, I want to try and get a 10% profit. So if your costs are $100, your price is then $110. And that's cost plus profit. Marginal costs are next. That's where you might be selling at close to break-even point and in some cases below break-even point for some products. In order to get sales in, you're selling at a marginal price, but you're knowing how much exactly that is and you have an idea of the marginal cost using break-even analysis and other things like that. Managing debtors. A few simple points here. Make sure the invoice is correct. Email it as well as posting it, because sometimes they don't get it in the post, or they say they don't get it in the post. Give options to pay, check, credit card, whatever other ways, electronic transfer. but give them choices. Finally, statements, monthly, email, by post. Follow up what's overdue in the accounts. Follow it up rigorously. In key accounts, know the system and have a contact to try and influence that. Use a traffic light system to manage debtors. You can see here in this example, some companies very slow at paying, so you'd follow up on those a lot more vigorously than any others. And in doing that, you keep an eye on the business and on the debtor levels. That is basically it. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.